And it was wonderful to address you again. So this is the third time that that I've addressed you, and Bishop Young says, I'm not new to you, you're not new to me. So that's it's really wonderful to be here with you again. So our theme in these 3 days is going to be kind of reflections that prepare us for the 2018 Synod, the upcoming Synod on youth, faith, and vocational discernment. And what I'm going to do in these days is to present to you on 5 topics. And then on Friday afternoon, we're going to have several experts on youth from the Hong Kong area talk about youth and their experience of working with youth. But the topics I'm going to present to you are, first of all, I'm going to reflect a bit on the Synod preparatory document, the so-called lineamenta, which is the document that we have so far to prepare for the Synod. And then this afternoon, I'm going to present a biblical theology of vocation. Then tomorrow morning, I'm going to present a more, I don't know if I would say systematic theology of vocation, but certainly a theology of vocation. And then, because I think behind the whole idea of vocation is a God who calls us to our own joy, a God who calls us to our own happiness and our own selves. As I'll say tomorrow, or when I talk about the theology of vocation, I strongly believe that God's will for us is ultimately our own heart's desire. And so in the 4th presentation, I'm going to be talking about what kind of God calls us to our own joy, calls us to our heart's desire. And then in my final presentation on Friday morning, I'm going to be talking about how we can discover how God is calling us. So a little work in the area of vocational discernment. So you have that on your schedule, but I just thought I'd mention it so you could kind of see how we're trying to progress in these days. So let's begin with my first presentation this morning on the Synod preparatory document. I'm going to try to give a summary of it. I know many of you have read it and read it carefully, but it always helps to review and have some other perspectives. I'm going to give some reflections and then a little bit of critique as well, especially as we begin our reflection on the document. So, in terms of introduction, I have to begin this presentation this morning with an apology. When Father Peter Choi invited me on behalf of Bishop Young to reflect on the upcoming Synod, for some reason in my mind, I thought the Synod was going to already be over. And that's why I said, oh yeah, I'd be happy to talk about the Synod. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. I can, give a summary of the best of the interventions and the final statement of the bishops and kind of, give you a summary of the whole thing. And then I discovered, after I had committed myself, that rather it was only in 2018, and that the only material that we have available are the lineamenta, or the preparatory document. And I said, when I began to prepare, I said, well, I hope this is going to be enough to give a talk on. So what I've decided to do is to give a summary of the document, a critique, and reflections as we go along. So let's look first of all at an overview of the document. And my sense is that this document as a lineamenta is really an extraordinary document. I want to stop here just a little bit to say, I know you have my PowerPoints. I'm always playing with my PowerPoints and changing things and so forth. I think you have the version of yesterday. I have a few little changes here and there. I'm always, I'm never quite satisfied with what I have. And the other thing is that I have a good bit of animation overlays, and so a lot of the slides will not be clear. So you might want to, also look up at the pretty pictures in color and everything, and follow along that way as well. But I hope that this will, jog your memory and help you follow along as well. But this is really an extraordinary document, and because of that, I do think that this document is enough for us in a kind of an initial presentation of reflections about the upcoming Synod. I think we can learn, and we have learned, an awful lot about the Synod from the document. But I want to say straight out that I don't think it's a perfect document. After all, it's a lineamenta. It's a first draft. It was sent out to the church all around the world to get some feedback. And so I think it's important that we also look at it a little bit critically as well. And I think the first thing, and I think this is really critical, is, at least for me, I don't think that the document defines vocation all that clearly. Now, it does offer a broad definition, and I love this definition, about the vocation to the joy of love. I think that's a beautiful idea, and as the document says, it means, the fundamental call that God has put in the heart of each person. That's very similar to what I was talking about before, that God's will is the heart's desire, and that God calls us to our deepest joy. But later in the document, and this is where I have a bit of a problem, it seems to restrict vocation to family life, the ordained ministry, or consecrated life. And then it goes on to say, one's profession and work for the common good. Now, tomorrow, when I talk about the theology of vocation, I'm going to offer a simple but concrete definition of vocations. Very, very simple, just 4 ideas. Vocation for me is God calls me through others for others. It's a definition of an American theologian by the name of Edward Hannenberg. And I'm also going to talk about the fact that vocation is first and foremost that vocation to be oneself, but then to be a disciple, to be married or single. Perhaps not all disciples are called to be ministers, but some are called to be ministers, lay or ordained. And the U.S. bishops, when they reflected on the lineamenta, they said the document talks about vocation is dealing with marriage, ordained ministry, or consecrated life. And I think that's too restrictive. I don't think, for instance, the document talks about the fact that perhaps the single lay life is actually a vocation. It's not a state where we wait for the right woman or man to come along to get married. It could be that we find ourselves in that God is really calling us to the single life. And there's no mention in the document of a vocation to lay ministry. And I think that in today's world is really important as well. So I think, first off, I think that just to restrict vocation, as has so often been done in the past, simply to marriage and ordained ministry and consecrated life, I think in today's understanding, particularly Pope Francis's understanding of missionary discipleship and how all are called to participate in the mission of the church, that we need to expand our understanding of vocation. And I really think this needs to be critiqued. I really hope that in the upcoming Instrumentum Laboris, the working document for the Synod, and the interventions of the bishops at the Synod, that this idea that the single life and lay ministry is really a genuine vocation and are important aspects of vocation in our church. A second critique that I'd like to make of the document is that it seems to me that the definition that the document gives of young people may be a bit restricted in today's world. The document says that by young people, it means those young women and men between 16 and 29. Now, I don't know about the situation in Hong Kong, but certainly in my own country, in the U.S., we're talking about, young adults, certainly up into their 30s, and even as early as 40. So for instance, in my congregation, the Society of the Divine Word, we accept people without, a special kind of we accept people without a special dispensation into our novitiate up to the age of 35. And we have some that are even older than that. And they still consider themselves young adults. There's this kind of prolongation of adolescence. At least it's true in my culture. I don't know, but it seems that this might be a trend throughout the world. I think people are marrying later. They're discerning religious life and priesthood later. I know I was talking with Father Peter the other day, and he said that candidates coming into the seminary here at Holy Spirit are in their late 20s or perhaps early 30s. So I wonder whether when we talk about, as Bishop Young has called for an emphasis on youth or young adults in this year, whether we might imagine a wider swath of age, rather than just, basically people in their teens, late teens, and through their 20s. And I don't know exactly what Bishop Young had in mind, but I read an article in Yukon when I was preparing for this that Bishop Young made a statement about the difficult economic situation of in Hong Kong, facing young people, you know, in terms of housing and the affordability of housing, and they're living with their parents even into their 30s. You know, so there's you know, I don't know, Bishop Young, if this fits in with what I'm trying to say, but it seems to me that when we talk about young adults or youth in this regard, maybe young adults sounds better than youth if you're, you know, 36, 37. But although for me it sounds pretty young. but nevertheless, I just wonder if it wouldn't be important for us pastorally to think a little more broadly in terms of the age range. Now, as I say, you know, the document is not perfect. But it really is, I think, quite an extraordinary document. I think when I read it, I said, you know, this breathes the atmosphere of freedom that Pope Francis has brought to the church. I think that on every page we see this kind of new sense of listening and dialogue, and these are words that are going to recur in the document and in my presentation that Pope Francis has brought to the church. I think over and over again, this document, if it says one thing clearly, it says, take young people seriously. They are not the future of the church. They are the church. And so they have to be taken as seriously as more seasoned adults in the church. And, you know, Francis has this wonderful line in Evangelii Gaudium when he talks about how the poor have much to teach us. I think this document says that young people, young adults, have much to teach us. And as the document says, it's significant that young people, often withdrawn into a stereotype, I wonder if that's a wrong translation. I wonder if it's more like often drawn according to a stereotype of passivity and inexperience, that young people propose and practice alternatives which show how the world could be. There's a fresh sense of imagination that young people have, that I think we as pastors can only profit by if we take them seriously. So I think, I'm sorry, the document speaks of accompanying youth. Again, this is a word that comes back time and time again. And not trying to control them, not seeing them as pastoral objects. You know, we have to get them into the church. We have to get them into the seminary or get them into religious life. You know, but rather to see them as subjects, to see them as agents. So it's this kind of, if I can use the term, Franciscan type of atmosphere that is that's present in the document, and that basic attitude, you know, of listening and dialogue, of authentic encounter. I think this is something that is really pervasive in the document, and I think leads us in a real direction as we emphasize young people in this year, but hopefully it won't end in this year. As Bishop Young says, this is a call to conversion. This is a call to recognize a whole important dimension of pastoral ministry. I think I was thinking about this, and I was thinking how this synod, this upcoming synod, is going to learn a lot from the Synod on New Evangelization. I think before the Synod on New Evangelization, Pope John Paul II talked about how the new evangelization is new in ardor, new in method, and new in content. And I think the emphasis tended to be before the Synod, the ardor aspect. We have to try harder. We have to make sure people know the catechism. We have to be clear about our doctrine. And then when the bishops got together in the council, and you see it then in the post-synodal apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis, those other two aspects, new methods, new ways of expressing the faith and presenting the church. I think these things came to the fore, and that's what I think that we've learned from the Synod on new evangelization in this regard. And I think this is what's happening, and what I think is going to very much happen in this Synod. The second aspect, I think, of this document's extraordinariness is its inclusivity in terms of gender and its recognition of women. This often doesn't happen in a Vatican document, that women have so prominent a role, and I think it's again an invitation to listen to the voices of young people, and to listen especially to the half of young people who are women. So in a paragraph, for instance, which talks about the multiplicity of worlds in which young people find their identity. The document talks about, well, there's difference in demographics, there's difference in various histories of different countries, there's difference in culture, but it also mentions that there's differences according to gender. And it says that gender offers also the basis for a different perception of reality. And when the document talks about, how there are basic forms of exclusion and domination and exclusion, that gender bias, that gender discrimination is certainly high among them. And then later on, when the document speaks of the difficulties that young people have in choosing their careers, it says that generally speaking, these obstacles are even more difficult for young women to overcome. And a paragraph later, it talks about gender inequality. And it listed as one of the cultural and religious factors that exclude young people from the careers that they want. So I think this is, for me, it's kind of an extraordinary thing that a document would emphasize this so much. I think it breathes, again, a kind of a fresh air that we need to take into account. A third extraordinary feature of the document is that it emphasizes the fact that the choice of vocation is not a simple one-time act, but it's the result of a lifelong process. All of us are constantly hearing God's call. You know, there are the basic vocations that we have, but also other vocations that we're called to in our lives. And in the introduction, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I go through the document, but in the introduction, it gives the example of John the beloved disciple and his own journey of growth as a disciple of Jesus, as he walks along with Jesus and listens to Jesus. The document also talks about Abraham and Sarah and their own journey of vocation. I'm going to talk about Abraham and Sarah's journey a little bit, this afternoon. And also Mary of Nazareth, that there's a development in their vocation. So it's not a one-time deal, but rather vocation is a lifetime process. There's one place in the document which quotes Pope Francis, and it's a talk that he gave, or it was really a dialogue that he had at a Catholic university in Italy. And so I looked at the footnote, and I went back and I read the original transcript of this. And it was a lovely discussion that Pope Francis had with these young people, and the quote that comes in the talk is an answer to a young woman, a young Italian woman, who said, you know, to Pope Francis, well, you know, Holy Father, I just find it hard to decide what I want to do with my life. There's so many choices, and there's so many things, and I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake if I make a choice. And Francis says, and here's the quote, the phrase I use very often is, take a risk, take a risk. Whoever does not risk does not walk. But if I make a mistake, but then he says, but if I make a mistake, bless the Lord. You will make more mistakes if you remain still. You know, so a typical Francis kind of quote. And I think a lovely way of talking about this, that our lives, you know, are this journey that we're on. And we need to, you know, the thing we need to do is, you know, there's that old proverb that says, you know, not to decide is to decide. And if we don't decide, we end up in a default mode. You know, so what Francis is saying, take a risk. You know, you can, enter the seminary, see what happens. Enter a religious life. You know, get involved in lay ministry. You know, and see how this works. You know, and you can change your mind. You know, but don't just sit there. You know, that's the point, because vocation is a lifelong journey. So let's turn now to the document itself and do a little bit of summary together with a few more reflections. The document consists, of course, of an introduction, and then it has 3 chapters, calls them really steps, but they're really kind of chapters or parts. And then there's a short conclusion, and then of course there are all the questions that are appended that we're supposed to go out for various points of discussion. The introduction has kind of 2 parts, and the first part links up the upcoming synod with the last 2 synods. So it speaks, so of course that was the synod on the new evangelization and the synod on the family. And the introduction goes on to speak about the mission of the church as bringing joy to the world. It's a beautiful way of, it's Amoris Laetitia, Evangelii Gaudium, you know, so the role of the church is to bring joy to the world. It's another way of talking about salvation, isn't it? You know, that the church's mission is to bring joy to the world. And again, those titles of those two apostolic exhortations, the joy of the gospel and the joy of love. And it talks about the fact that the upcoming synod then, its task is to find ways to help young people find the deep joy that God has in store for them in their life, that God has in store for them in their vocations. And then the second part of the introduction talks about it's hard to read this. Emphasizes. Sorry about that. I have a very small screen. Very small screen here. It emphasizes that this idea of the lifelong process that vocation involves, and I think this is going to be one of the basic attitudes that the synod is going to take. And again, as I mentioned briefly before, it gives the example of John, the beloved disciple. John starts out with that question early in the gospel, you know, where do you live? And of course Jesus answers, come and see. And then the gradual friendship that Jesus and John develop during Jesus's ministry, culminating at the Last Supper, where John is beside Jesus and lays his head on Jesus' breast. And then John, the only disciple faithful in John's gospel, to be at the foot of the cross with the women, with Mary and the other women. And then receiving Mary, Jesus' mother, as his mother. And then finally culminating at the recognition of the risen Christ on the Sea of Galilee. They're out in the boat, and John says, "It is the Lord." And of course, Peter, you know, jumps in the sea and swims toward Jesus. And the document said that this is all summarized in that beautiful first line of the first letter of John. What we have seen, what we have heard, what we've experienced. This is what I'm going to pass on to you. So the second part, again, emphasizes the ongoing, the lifelong aspect of vocation. And then we move into part one, which talks about young people in today's world. It's kind of like setting the context of young people in today's world. Now, it begins, of course, with a disclaimer that this is not a comprehensive analysis of society or of young people's world, but it says, you know, some things can be said in general about young people's world and about the characteristics of young people today. The main characteristic of the world, the document says, and it quotes Pope Francis in Laudato Si, is a rapid process of change and transformation. We are all living in an age of what we called years ago future shock. That things are happening so fast and changing so fast that we're simply dazzled by the whole thing. And of course, in many ways, young people revel in that kind of fast-paced change. Again, very typical of the document, it says, let's not judge this negatively or positively. Let's not look at it as a problem or even as an opportunity. Let's just say this is the situation of the world. So it doesn't condemn it, you know, it doesn't glorify it. It simply says this is the situation that we are in. It goes on, of course, to talk about how today's world is marked by globalization, and particularly the poverty that globalization leaves in its wake. Globalization which excludes millions of people, the document says, including many young people, and leads to the indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources and environmental degradation, threatening the future of upcoming generations. This is a note that is very familiar, of course, in Pope Francis, when he talks about today's throwaway culture, that people, there are certain people that don't matter. And so many of those people in these throwaway cultures are young people today. The document goes on to say that these phenomena, along with the multicultural and multi-religious situation of so many societies, I'm not sure, again, because I'm not that familiar with Hong Kong, but I would imagine there is a certain multiculturality in Hong Kong. Certainly in my own country, in many countries of the world, there's a strong sense of this. And then, of course, the multi-religious situation of many societies. And again, it says these things require, these things come back again, listening, respect, and dialogue. And then the document, after it does this kind of, you know, just broad stroke picture of the world in which we live, and particularly the world in which young people live, it makes a focus on young people themselves. And it singles out the difficulties of immigrant children in some parts of the world. You know, where young people experience, as it says, particular hardships which pose difficulties for them in making real choices of life. They can't always do what they would like to do, what they feel called to do because of the pressing poverty, because of discrimination and so forth, because of cultural, economic, religious forces that inhibit their freedom. We have to accept the characteristics that the document names with some kind of caution, but the document nevertheless says here are a few characteristics of young people in today's world. And the first one is that young people want to be engaged in building the future. They are committed to action, the document says. And they deplore situations where they feel they're not included. Many young people, and they use the word NEET, N-E-E-T, which means not employed in education or in training. There's so many young people like this, it makes them feel passive and discouraged. So on the one hand, the characteristic is this strong sense of wanting to contribute, wanting to be part of the world. But on the other hand, because of so many factors, young people are unemployed. They aren't getting a good enough education. They aren't getting the training that they need to live lives that they would like to lead. I am reminded in reading this of something that my colleague Robert Schreiter often says. I think you had Bob Schreiter here 2 years ago for your clergy renewal camp as well, and Bob talks about the fact that where there are large numbers of unemployed young males, there's going to be violence. You know, and we certainly see that in the United States, in my town of Chicago, in terms of African American men. You know, I think we see it in terms of Muslim men around the world, and I think it's a pattern. These, you know, neat people, you know, particularly in terms of young men, this is one of the reasons for the cycle of violence that we have. The second thing that the document wants to point out in terms of characteristics of young people is that they need examples. They need mentors. As the document puts it, they need persons or institutions of reference. So credible persons and credible institutions. The document says young people look for persons who are able to express empathy, support, encouragement, and help in recognizing their limits, but without making them feel they are being judged. Again, how many times the document comes back to put a positive spin on young people. Don't judge them. You know, don't get impatient with them. Try to help them as much as possible. The document also says that young people need to interact with their peers. I see this in a way as a kind of a peer mentoring as well. And I'm reminded of a program that I'm involved in Chicago, which is called Catholics on Call. It's a program for vocational discernment. And every year we run a conference of young adults, and again we see young adults as between 18 and 35, something like that. We run this conference, and we usually have 35, 50 young adults, and we have 3 or 4 days of talks and discernment and exposure to ministry and things like that. But one of the things that they say is that, and these are people who are considering some kind of life of ministry in the church, whether it's religious life or priesthood or lay ministry. And one of the things they say, you know, is that this is the first place I can actually talk with people who understand me. You know, so many of my peers in college or in the workplace or whatever, they think I'm nuts to be interested in priesthood or to be interested in religious life. And here, there's a whole group of young women and men, more or less my own age, who share my values, who share my struggles, who share my interests. And so, you know, to get this kind of a peer mentoring together, I think is a really important thing, because this seems to be really what people deeply need. At the same time that people look, you know, for credible institutions and credible mentors, young people often nourish mistrust, indifference, or anger toward institutions. And this also includes the church. The document is very open on this. It says young people have learned to rely minimally on institutional and rely more on informal forms of spirituality. And so the line that's very popular in my country a lot, I don't know if you hear it here in Hong Kong, but I'm spiritual but not religious. You know, I believe in a spiritual life, but I'm not interested in going to church. I'm not interested in getting involved in an institution. And what the document says is that the church then needs to work at being more credible, being more open and inclusive. And I think, again, this breathes the spirit of Pope Francis. You know, the church has to be the house of the father of the prodigal son, a mother with an open heart, a place where doors are always open and that mercy is freely given. You know, so I think, you know, if we are going to attract young people, and this is a great word also Pope Francis, which he takes from Pope Benedict as well, if we're going to attract young people to the church, we have to do it with an institution that is going to be open and welcoming, again, takes them seriously. And of course, we as adults and as ministers and pastors need to be credible as well. A third characteristic of young people today is obvious, the relationship with modern technology. With all the advantages of modern technology, all the possibilities of modern technologies, but also all the disadvantages and all the dangers. You know, isolation, addiction to pornography, the possibility of sexual predators getting on the internet, and this whole kind of thing. And the document says that the church is called upon to evaluate her pastoral activity, which needs to develop an appropriate culture. A fourth characteristic is one that the document actually spends a lot of time on, and it's one that, you know, if you know young people and work with young people, it's definitely an issue that you have to deal with, the seeming inability of young people today to make commitments. And perhaps it's the result of, at least for many people in many parts of the world, the many choices that the contemporary world provides. Perhaps it's a result of individualism that has grown up among young people, but particularly in the West. Again, I go back to that conversation that Pope Francis had with that young Italian woman, a university student, you know, who was afraid to make a choice, afraid to take a risk. And Francis says, you know, take a risk, change if you have to. You know, and I think it's this kind of flexibility, you know, that we have to develop in the church. The second part of the document talks about faith, discernment, and vocation. This is, I think, in some ways, one of the weaker aspects of the document. I find it a little bit vague, but it has some nice things to say. In the introductory paragraphs, again, it falls back on the idea that the church is committed to accompany young people. That word, accompany, is a favorite word of theology in Latin America. Again, it breathes, I think, the spirit of Francis, you know, the Latin American Pope. And this idea of accompaniment, that I've already said, figures so prominently in the document. Just walking with young people. This picture of Pope Francis from, I think, World Youth Day, the last World Youth Day, is a wonderful kind of icon, you know, of what this means. So walking with young people as they deal with weaknesses and difficulties in their own lives. Pope Francis talked about accompaniment right away in his inaugural homily, and it's quoted in the document, that we accompany young people in tenderness, the capacity for concern, for compassion, for genuine openness to others, for love. Vocation, the document says, is rooted in faith. But it's not a timid faith. It's a faith that is bold and generous. It's not just an intellectual kind of faith. It's not just the warm feeling of faith. It's a faith that moves into action. And so it quotes Pope Francis's first encyclical, Pope Benedict's last encyclical, however you want to see that, to say that faith is no refuge for the faint-hearted, but something which enhances our lives. It makes us aware of a magnificent calling, a vocation of love. It assures us that this love is worth embracing. And a line that I really like, or an idea that I really like in this regard, is the document talks about how faith gives us eyes and ears to see and hear how God is calling us in our lives. It's a kind of an amplifier, you know, or a magnifying glass to help us see better and help us listen better to the Spirit's working in our world. And so as we listen in faith and dialogue, we practice the art of discernment. And the document talks about 3 words that are taken from Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 51, that goes into this. It's a kind of a see, judge, and act, I think. First of all, recognizing, to sort through feelings and desires in a kind of an objective, non-judgmental way. So this is what I'm feeling, this is where I'm going, this is how I see myself reacting. But then interpreting, trying to make a judgment on the importance of a feeling or an emotion, and then finally coming to a choice which is always a risk. But it's not an impulsive choice, it's not an irrational choice, but a choice is always one that somehow involves a risk. But it's a matter of real kind of discernment, recognizing how we feel and recognizing the importance of that feeling, the importance of that movement in our hearts for our lives. You know, maybe sometimes we make a wrong choice, but you know, that's how we learn. Following up on some things that Pope Francis was talking about, and as we live out our choices, it soon becomes clear which ones are right and which ones are not. But in any case, the document emphasizes, again, this is, you know, repeats over and over again, that vocational discernment is not something that's a once and for all single act, but it's a lifelong task. And it says we shouldn't be discouraged by hardships, but learn to embrace the cross that opens us up in untold ways to growth. And all of us who have gone through that understand that. Again, as young people walk the threefold way of discernment, they need the accompaniment of God's Spirit. But they also need that, again, we go back to mentoring, to trustworthy women and men. But when these women and men accompany young people, again, the steam comes back rather than trying to manipulate their decision, the document advises that mentors look to Jesus' way of encountering women and men in his ministry. So Jesus offers a loving look, the call of the disciples. He becomes the true neighbor in the way he heals, the way he relates to people. He walks beside the discouraged disciples on the road to Emmaus. He goes against preconceived ideas at the Last Supper by the washing of the feet. So Jesus doesn't manipulate. Jesus truly accompanies. So I do think, however, as I say, that this section is pretty vague. I hope to speak a little bit more concretely about the art of discernment in my 5th talk, which will be on Friday morning. We come to the 3rd part of the document, which then is pastoral activity. Begins by saying, how does the church help young people accept their call to the joy of the gospel? So this first sentence of the 3rd section of the document, I think, it paints a broad stroke picture of the pastoral activity that's needed to help young people discern their vocations, especially in times of uncertainty and volatility and insecurity. Accompaniment is again front and center here. Again, it offers a non-judgmental attitude towards the church's youth. To accompany means to go beyond a preconceived framework, encountering young people where they are, adapting to their times and pace of life, and taking them seriously. You see, if you don't get it the first time, it keeps on coming back. And it talks about 3 words for a pastoral style that needs to be developed by the church. And these words are, first of all, going out, and then seeing, and finally calling. So the first going out, it's very much in tune with Francis's understanding of a church that goes forth. It's a less rigid, more creative approach to mission. And then again, to really see young people, to spend time with them, listen with them, appreciate their culture. And only after this, then to call them to the journey of discernment. The young people, the document insists that young people are not only objects, but are subjects of ministry. And as young people are exposed to service, hands-on service and ministry, then they can imagine a life of such service. As the Latin American proverb says, you make your path by walking. As you experience this, your imagination begins to be stirred up. But again, young people don't walk alone. They need the entire Christian community to walk with them. And that's why young people need to be included in all the activities of the Christian community. Not just, relegated to a youth group, but integrated into the whole Christian community. They need to be involved in diocesan and parish communities, starting with pastoral councils, inviting young people to make their creative contribution, even when they appear challenging. And that's so often the case when young people are included. And then the document lists some specific places for meeting for meeting, like cultural formation, education, evangelization, celebration, and service. First among those is World Youth Day. Then it talks about how parishes need to be open, universities, Catholic schools, volunteer work, getting people to go on pilgrimages, ecclesial movements. Seminaries and houses of formation have strategic importance for retreats and outings and centers of spiritual direction. And you saw that here, right at Holy Spirit Seminary on New Year's Eve, where something like 100 young people came, and the whole basketball court was filled with tents. I wish I had taken a picture of that so I could put that up here. It was very colorful, all these tents, and how they spent the night in adoration and in prayer. And I think that's what the document is calling pastors to do, is to find ways, many ways, where youth can be included in the pastoral life of the church. The second last part, the penultimate part of this third section, talks about pastoral resources that are needed for young people. And it talks about a constant search for the proper language and expressions to speak to young people. It says the church needs to get accustomed to the fact that the ways of approaching the faith are less standardized, and therefore must become more attentive to the individuality of each person. And one way of doing this is being open to receive everyone, following the example of Jesus, who could speak with Jews and Samaritans, with pagans in Greek culture and Roman occupiers, seizing upon the deep desires of each of them. And maybe, being more and more open to all those people whom the church has excluded and whom Pope Francis has reached out in so many ways to touch. And finally, the document talks about the importance of silence and contemplation and prayer. I know this is so true. I think we saw it on New Year's Eve here at the seminary, but also in our Catholics on Call program. We always have an evening of Taizé prayer. We always have an evening of Eucharistic adoration. And the young people really, as you know, really love that. So the whole move to silence and contemplation and prayer, I think really helps young people to discern the paths in their life. Now the document ends, as all documents do from Rome, with a reference to Mary. And Mary is the person to whom the Synod process is entrusted. And it calls to mind Mary, who so fully embraced her vocation. And it says, in her eyes, every young person can rediscover the beauty of discernment. In her heart, every young person can experience the tenderness of intimacy and the courage of witness and mission. So I come to my own conclusion now, and this is the document that I had to work with. I wish I had more to share. I wish I could have wonderful zingers from various bishops throughout the world, getting up and inspiring us like, in previous synod. We'd have to wait a year for that. I thought I would have it, but no, I didn't. But I do think that the document gives us an awful lot. I think it really might also help us understand the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris, that will be coming out most likely in a few weeks. So I do hope that this kind of overview has been helpful, not too repetitive for those who have studied the document so carefully. And I do hope that the Synod is going to take the experience of young people seriously, to help them answer this question, which is a line from a famous poem by the American poet Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So thank you very much. Thank you.